Good evening, I'm Jabari Morris, and this is MMT Mondays. Tonight, let's talk about the right and wrong, the weak and strong, of deficits, surpluses, and how the money really flows in all sectors of a nation's economy, including international trade. Make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and let's get to it. This graph illustrates the perfect mirror image between the government's financial balance, the private sector balance, and the inverse of the capital account, because we're looking at the surplus of the rest of the world. The mirror image from the graph clearly illustrates how the government deficit is reflected into a private sector surplus. If the government is spending more than it is taxing, it is stimulating the economy, not taking away from it. In this video, Professor Bill Mitchell explains how a nation's balance of trade determines whether it should run a government deficit or surplus.
It makes no sense for the government to think of the fiscal balance in isolation. The purpose of fiscal policy isn't to generate a surplus or a balance or a deficit of 1% of GDP. That's thinking in isolation. The purpose of fiscal policy is that is government spending and taxation. The purpose of that is to ensure there's enough spending in the economy to create full employment and prosperity and allow the non-government sector saving desires to be realised. That's the purpose of fiscal policy. So when you're evaluating the state of the fiscal situation, you're not looking at the number, you're looking at how many people are employed and how prosperous the economy is. And you might have a situation where a deficit of 1% of GDP is appropriate, but another situation when a deficit of 5% of GDP is appropriate. And then again, in some situations, a surplus of 1% of GDP might be appropriate. And how we determine which of those three options is appropriate depends upon what the non-government sector is doing. So for Norway, for example, the non-government sector savings are strong overall. Its government has small surpluses. Why? Because its export sector is so strong. But for most countries that don't have booming export sectors, to be able to allow the domestic non-government sector to save, the government has to run a deficit. That's the fact. And so when we're looking at what's been going on in the Eurozone, you asked me about austerity. Well, all of the economics books I've ever read tell us that if non-government sector spending is falling and there's rising unemployment, then the solution for the government has to be to increase its net spending, its deficit, has to. That's what economic theory tells us. And these statements from Brussels and IMF that we've got to have austerity to restore growth are not economic statements, they're ideological statements. They have no foundation in economics. Cutting government spending at a time when non-government sector spending is falling is the height of irresponsibility. And you know that that's just ideological statements, that they want to limit government, size of government, and force governments to privatise and to cut back on pensions and government employment. So the fact is that it's not just modern monetary theory that says this, all economic theory really says that you should never run pro-cyclical fiscal policy. You always should use fiscal policy to offset non-government sector spending dynamics, not to reinforce them in one direction or the other.
In this clip from Macro and Cheese, Professor L. Randall Wray explains the concept of sectoral balances and why the U.S., which runs a large trade deficit, needs to run a federal deficit to keep its economy out of recession.
If we ever did enact a balanced budget amendment and were able to actually hit this, now that's questionable whether we can hit it, but let's say that we could hit it. The United States, at any reasonable growth rate, is going to have a trade deficit. This is just the reality of the world right now today. We can go into why that's true. But when our economy is doing well, our trade deficit will hit 6 to 8% of GDP. When we're doing poorly, it falls to 3 or 4% of GDP. If the government has a balanced budget and we have something slightly broader than a trade deficit, it's called a current account deficit, a balanced government budget and a current account deficit of 5%, by definition, by accounting identity, the private sector, taken as a whole, is going to be running a deficit of 5% of GDP, equal to that current account deficit. Private sector deficits are very rare and extremely dangerous. We had a private sector deficit essentially from 1996 until 2006. And that was one of the fundamental causes of the global financial crisis. We crashed when the private sector no longer could service their debt and people started defaulting on excessive debt. We don't even need the defaults. All we need is for people to realize, hey, I'm too far in debt. I'm going to stop borrowing. I'm going to start repaying my debt. The economy will crash as soon as that happens, if you have a balanced budget and a current account deficit. So the problem, this is what we learned from Win Godley's sectoral balances, is that at the aggregate level, balances have to balance. For every deficit, there has to be a surplus. Okay? For every surplus, there has to be a deficit. So if the government is going to run a balanced budget, but we have a deficit with the rest of the world has a surplus against us, then our private sector will be in deficit, going further and further into debt. And that is extremely dangerous for the economy because it creates financial problems, financial instability, as Minsky said. So that is why you have to understand the sectoral balances and what you're implying by saying the government will always balance its budget. Essentially, you're saying that means the private sector can never balance the budget. It will always have a deficit in the case of the United States.
As you can see, the total sum of a nation's sectoral balances will always amount to zero. Whether a nation should run a government deficit or a surplus depends largely on its trade balance. A nation like the U.S., which currently runs a large trade deficit, should also run a government deficit to offset the trillions of dollars leaving the economy. Conversely, a nation like Norway should run a government surplus to stave off the inflationary effects of running a trade surplus. If you enjoyed tonight's video, make sure to check us out at realprogressives.org and subscribe to get notifications on new video streams in YouTube, Periscope, Twitch, Facebook, and Rockfin. Thank you and continue learning.